Hey everyone, welcome to the Retriever Nutrition and Preseason Conditioning Masterclass today. Really excited to have everyone on board. We've got a great panel of experts here to help get us ready for the season. We're gonna let some people jump on here and give it a few minutes, but just a reminder that that your videos are turned off and it is muted, so we can't see you or hear you. If you have any questions, though, be sure to put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Would love for you to ask questions to our panel of guests today. And there's this also chat function. People love to use it to talk amongst themselves, or a lot of people will start off with saying where you're from, what kind of things you like to hunt. Hopefully, ducks is one of them. So, and then we also have got a few great giveaways today. So be sure there is a link posted. So be sure to sign up for those giveaways tonight. But we'll kick things off. Like I said, we've got a fantastic group of folks tonight that have got years and years of expertise in training and also on the health and nutrition side as well. So I'm going to go from my left to right as I see on the screen here. First, we have Mr. Ray Voigt. Ray, will you just give a little bit of background on yourself and tell folks who you are?
Yeah, so Ray Boyd, I am a senior specialist for Purina for the Sporting Dog Group. I work specifically with retrievers and spaniels mostly. Before I've been with Purina for about 5 years, so that kind of entails sponsorships of organizations and events, and so anything retriever related, field trials or hunt tests, anything that Purina does with those, kind of goes through me. Uh, 20 years previous to that, I was a professional retriever trainer, competed in field trials and hunt tests pretty much across the entire country. And so that's kind of what drew me to Purina, was the being able to continue working with the dogs and the retrievers and of the same people. And I love it.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate you joining us. Next, I have Mr. Joe Spoo.
Joe Spoo. I'm a sports medicine rehabilitation specialist. I live in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. My career out here started because of duck hunting. I lived in northern Minnesota after graduation, and when I didn't draw the non-resident waterfowl lottery license for South Dakota the second year, I moved out to South Dakota. Instead, I figured out here. My wife and I built a specialty practice here in Sioux Falls, a combination of specialty general practice. A few years ago, we sold that, and it's allowed me more time to focus on the online content. And so for the last year, I've really developed content at the gundogdoc.com website and on Instagram, including a field emergency and first aid course, covering pretty much every sort of topic that you're going to encounter as far as emergencies in the field with your hunting dog.
Awesome. And one thing to note too, if you haven't seen it yet, if you're an onX Elite member, you get access to exclusive videos from the Gundog Doc courses, as well as a discount on the entire course. So if you haven't seen that, be sure to check that out. We'll post a link in the chat here if you want to look into it. So Joe, we appreciate you jumping on tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Next, we have Dr. Janelle.
So my clients call me Dr. J, a little easier to go by. I'm a veterinarian and canine rehabilitation therapist out of Thomasville, Georgia. And I have a 28-foot mobile sports medicine practice, primarily focusing on retrievers, mostly in the hunt test and field trial world. And that allows me to go to weekend field trial events and national events throughout the country, and basically focusing on education and prevention of injury for these dogs.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you for being. I know you're on the road, so we're excited to have you tonight. Yeah. And then last but not least, Josh Miller, Retriever Roadmap. Thanks for coming on. We'd love to get a background on you.
Yeah, you bet, buddy. So Glad to be back. This panel is a fun one because although Dr. J and I just met here about 5 minutes ago, everybody else on here, I have a great long relationship with. So it's fun to get everybody together. For those that don't know me, my name is Josh Miller. I own Riverstone Kennels, which we're based out of Western Wisconsin. Specialize in retrievers. My wife and I do breed British Labs. I spend a number of trips overseas every year, attending trials and hunts there, but really what fuels me was, going all the way back to when I was, about 13 years old and kind of got bit by the duck hunting bug. And now I hunt usually about 90 to 100 days a year in the field. And so I'll start up in Alberta, work my way down, and I end at my duck camp in Arkansas. So it's something that we look forward to all year. We love the training, we love testing, we love everything that goes about building these retrievers. But it is truly fueled by that passion of being in the field, chasing waterfowl. So it's something we're extremely passionate about. And then Retriever Roadmap, like Ben had said, is a big partner of onX. And basically where that came from was we'd have a lot of people, especially since COVID, that were calling the kennel, asking for advice of how to train their dog at home. And I genuinely love helping people. I love giving seminars. I love speaking. But what got difficult was, when you talk to somebody, you don't know what they've done with their dog, to that point. And there's a lot of prerequisites. So a phone call that somebody might think might be a 5-minute phone call turns into, an hour and a half really quickly. And we would just do a lot of rehashing. So we built this online program so that everybody could kind of see from start to finish a video-based library. And we've introduced some new trainers in there too, so you can get kind of some different ideas and different vibes. But the whole thing with the program is that anybody at home can go do it. We really tried to build it to where you didn't need to have a tech pond, you didn't need to have some of this stuff that although very beneficial, we're fortunate to have that kind of stuff. That anybody at home can do this. So it's been a great program, a great community, and something we're really proud to be partners of onX with.
Mute button. There we go. Like Josh was saying, onX partner as an elite member, again, similar to the Gun Dog Doc, you get access to a curated set of videos as well as a discount on the complete series. So appreciate again everyone being here today. And the topic is preseason retriever nutrition and conditioning. So we are going to break down everything from feeding all the way to getting your dog ready for the duck season, the waterfowl season. For a lot of those, that could be early goose or later in the year for ducks. So really excited here, and we're just going to get right into it. So the first topic is nutrition, and really with the thought in mind of it's time to get your dog ready, try to get them into shape. The first thing is starting with nutrition, starting with their body condition to make sure they can withstand those rigors. So Dr. J, if you wouldn't mind just breaking down kind of where you start, how you evaluate a dog to know where you should even start conditioning.
Yeah, great question. So our biggest concern is weight. Obviously, a lot of these dogs have been on the couch for a while. They're not as active as usual coming into hunting season. So definitely making sure that we have as best of a body condition as possible coming into the season. Hopefully we don't get to the point where we get out of shape, but if we do, there's a great scale that I go by, and it helps clients really kind of understand what the ideal body condition looks like, because it's really hard. You can't just put a number on a dog. Every dog's body's a little different in terms of weight. So, we can describe things like seeing the last couple ribs or being able to feel the pelvis, but this body condition score chart through Purina is actually something that I use a lot. And it's a great way to explain in words, but also show clients pictures of what the dog's ideal body condition should be. And for a retriever coming into hunting season, the body condition of around 3 to 4 is what we're looking at. And you'll see that scale goes from 1 to 9.
So depending on where they're at, it's going to probably be a combination of exercise and feeding, but what does that look like to get them to that first step, to even to say, hey, we can actually go out and do somewhat strenuous activity? Is that a change in volume, formula? What does that look like?
So it really depends on where that dog has been. You know, if the dog has been not doing much at all activity wise and has been fed an amount of food that is putting them over conditioned shape, then we certainly need to back up on the amount. But also, if they've been feeding a performance food throughout the year with a lack of activity, that can put on weight quicker too. So it just depends on what that dog has been eating. If we need to back down on the amount of protein and fat temporarily to get that weight off, the excess weight is what really leads to injury and can predispose to injury. So that's a huge concern of mine. And any way we need to get that weight off quickly is what I'm focused on.
And I know that there's lots of trains of thought. A lot of people feed a high protein, high fat throughout the year, and others will switch. Dr. Joe, will you talk about that a little bit and talk about your approach?
Yeah. So I think that, you know, the big thing is preventing this yo-yoing and looking at nutrition over the course of the entire year. And too many people don't do that. I think we get in the habit of feeding the same amount twice a day or once a day all year long, regardless of activity and in what you're asking of your dog, when actually, especially with these super premium foods, they're kind of unforgiving with overfeeding. And so you have that dog that, like right now, you know, the whole country's going into a real heat wave where there's not going to be a lot of activity. The dead of winter in this part of the country, there's not a lot of activity. And so we'll see dogs, you know, twice a year that end up putting on a lot of weight, you know, at the end of summer, which is dangerous going into hunting season. And then again, at the end of winter. So in between hunting season and spring training, we'll see dogs that get heavy. And so the first thing I would say is trying to prevent that up and down with your dog and try to stay in that 3 to 4 range, as Dr. J talked about, as opposed to getting up in that 5 and 6 and then saying, oh, we're going to thin them down at the start of hunting season. Because what happens is that's going to be the time they're most prone to injury, is the start of season, and the most prone to heat stroke as well. And so I think with the retrievers, my personal opinion is that the vast majority of these dogs don't need to be on a performance formula. The performance formulas, in my opinion, should have been called endurance formulas. They're meant for dogs with heavy workloads. And not that there aren't retrievers that qualify for that, but I'm talking, you know, most hunters that I see in the practice, these dogs aren't working for extended hours during the day. You might have that 30-minute training session morning to night. They're not like the pointing dogs that are potentially running for hours and hours on end at a very high speed. And so I think there's a misconception in the sporting dog world that the food makes the dog, as opposed to you have a performance dog and then you're going to feed it something. It's not that performance product makes your dog a performance dog. And so I think being really self-aware of that. Am I always at that 5 and 6 number, or maybe once in a while touch the 4, or do I really have a dog in shape? And that's going to determine the formula that I'm going to be on. There's no shame in a dog being fed an adult maintenance formula if that's what it requires to keep it in great shape. As I get older, I have to eat a lot less calories. Even, you know, when I'm running and doing all the things I did in my 20s and 30s, I can't eat like I did when I was younger. And so I've had to calorically restrict myself for the first time in my life these last, you know, 5 to 10 years. But my activity level, I'd like to think, is the same. And so it's one of those that I think we just need to be honest with ourselves. How active are these dogs? How much am I feeding? And what formula should I be on to keep that yo-yoing from occurring?
Awesome. Josh and Ray, I'd be curious from your experience of seeing a lot of dogs go through your kennels, kind of what are your strategies for feeding, especially as you're getting ready for the fall? Have at it, Ray.
All right. So, I mean, we were competing year round. So we kept the dogs on the 30-20 performance diet. We fed the salmon, the Purina 30-20 salmon and rice. And we would vary the amount, you know, if during the summer, you know, July was a real slow time for us. December was a real slow time for us. When the dogs would go home, they typically stayed on the performance diet, but we would make sure that the owners knew to cut the food back. So, you know, just like Dr. Joe was saying, it's caloric intake, you know, calories in, calories out. So if you're not burning those calories, you don't need that many calories. So They didn't have enough downtime probably to warrant a diet change, because we could manage it by just cutting back by half a cup or a cup, depending on the dog. Right now, my own dog, who I'd say gets moderate amount of work, she's on the 30-20, and I can tell a half a cup makes a difference for her. So I mean, I like to keep her on that at this point. Like as Dr. Joe said, as she gets older and her needs change, that could vary. But as long as I'm 100% on board with the yo-yoing. You don't want that up and down. I want to keep them at a steady weight. And right now, with her energy level, a 30-20 does that. But if they're on the couch all the time, and it's more important to have them lean than just to say they're on a performance diet versus not.
Yeah,
Josh, how about yourself? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, I'd echo some of that. When we get dogs in, oftentimes the reality is that they're overweight. I think just generally speaking from a mass, a comment, kind of a broad stroke, is that everybody loves to love their dog, and from a human standpoint, love means extra scraps, extra treats, extra everything, which of course, as we know, usually leads to extra fat around the hips. And so we don't love seeing the beer keg with legs look walking through the door. We don't see a ton of that, but we do see a dog that's overweight. And a dog that's overweight, generally speaking, mentally isn't going to be as sharp and as enthusiastic, and for us isn't going to be able to maintain a training session for as long naturally, right? It's same as if you were overweight and went into a marathon training, obviously you're not going to last as long until you get into shape to actually perform at that level. And so, the nice thing about, for us and everybody on this panel is that we're around it enough where we can really understand, the differences dog to dog, because there is no easy answer to this, right? There's not a one size fits all. So there is going to be, tweaks and balances for each dog. And then for each dog, you may see seasonality changes, so there isn't, just one set. Now, I have dogs that I swear I can feed the exact same thing all year round and they look fantastic. And then I have others that during season, when we're at days, 50, 60, 70, I'm feeding, 2+ times, the amount of time, food that they're feeding, the rest of the time. And then after season, as we kind of take that, maybe like 30 days off, all of a sudden I got to cut them way back because they're going to put that on. And so it really does depend, and just kind of, watching, that dog. For me, I would rather see a dog a hair underweight than overweight. And I think the reason I can confidently say that is because I think a lot of us, look at our dogs and, if we can see any kind of ribs at all, I think, naturally sometimes we panic a little bit. And I think if we can, I think Dr. J had mentioned, that 1 or 2 ribs, we're okay with that. Right? Like, we want to see these dogs in shape. We want to see them, being able to be active without having to, worry about, shutting down, getting injured. There's a lot that goes into, carry on that extra weight. And then, from that prep standpoint, doing this, now, thinking about this now and prepping for, when you get into September and October is important, because if you're trying to make the same change at, August 25th, you're just not going to be successful, and you're going to push that dog into probably an unfair situation. So the reality is it's up to us as owners to monitor and maintain that for our dogs.
Yeah, and you touched on a little bit, Josh, but in terms of, you said you're feeding twice a day. I hear this is a question I see brought up quite frequently is how many times a day should you feed? What, should you feed before the hunt in the morning? Should you feed immediately after? Should it be in the evening? So, Dr. J, what are your thoughts on that?
So I would say 90% of my patients are on once a day feedings in the evenings. However, there is a percentage of dogs that literally burn calories, as they wake up because they're so high. So they do require some extra calories, even on a performance food. And some dogs, we even had to supplement on top of an additional feeding with a protein and fat supplement powder over the food. So there are definitely those cases that are going to require that extra feeding. However, I prefer that it's at least 2 to 3 hours before exercise. So basically getting up first thing in the morning and feeding. If it's a half cup to a cup, I prefer no more than a cup for a morning feeding. And again, make sure we put some extra water in there to help that digestive process go a little bit faster and get that food through the stomach. But yes, there are definitely situations that warrant twice a day feeding.
The mute got me again. So kind of backing up to a little bit, I wanted to ask in terms of, we see our dogs every day, right? So it's like you don't notice them progressively get potentially larger. What's a good method for, whether it's the body score or are you weighing them? What's the best way to actually track progress?
Definitely weights. That's a huge thing with a truck full of dogs. We weighed those dogs every 2 weeks, and that was a pretty standard thing to make sure we were keeping track of their body weight. But definitely also knowing your dog, knowing how your dog feels. So, looking at that body condition chart and understanding the things, the bony prominences on the body that you should be able to see or feel. And you can do that actively on your dog and make sure that you're feeling those things consistently. And if you're not, then you need to make a change.
Very interesting. So on kind of a similar vein as nutrition, when we look at a lot of questions again about supplements, what I'd love to get your guys' thoughts on, are you offering supplements or not? And if so, what are your kind of your go-tos? Dr. J, you can just pick it up.
So for my competitive athletes in the hunt, test, and field trial world, they are on 3 major supplements, one being omega-3s, the second being a oral supplement. Typically, I use Dasquin Advanced, and mostly not for the benefit of it's a chondroitin glucosamine supplement, but not really for the benefit of those, which we don't really have a lot of science on, but mostly for the curcumin, which is essentially a turmeric extract that is more bioavailable to the dog. It's highly anti-inflammatory. And also a product called ASU, which is in the Dasquin Advanced, which is an avocado unsaponifiable extract, also highly anti-inflammatory. There is some really good science with ASU in dogs and humans. So I specifically use that product for those ingredients as an anti-inflammatory benefit. These dogs that are working all week long and then competing on weekends, we are creating abnormal stress in those joints because the amount of work that they do is an excessive amount of work for the joints themselves. So the way I look at it is anything we can do to help decrease the amount of inflammation that occurs in the joints, that's a positive thing long-term for these dogs. So omega-3s can do that for sure. And also the third thing I use is Adequin, which is an injectable form under the skin. It's given twice a week for 4 weeks as an induction series. And then once every 2 weeks in my athletes is what I recommend. And again, the idea behind this is that we are trying to keep inflammation at bay when it does occur in the joints, because we know it's going to occur. These dogs take falls. They are running miles and miles every day in training. So we know we're creating this inflammation. What can we do to help prevent that and hopefully ward off some arthritic changes in the joint?
So is that something you said it's an injection. Is that something somebody would have to bring, that you would recommend them bringing them to the vet, or can you do it yourself, or what does that situation look like?
You can absolutely do it yourself. It's an injection given under the skin, just like a vaccine. I usually have my clients have their veterinarian show them how to give it, and it's very easy to do yourself. Typically, I'll give it, when the dog is eating, so they're otherwise occupied, not thinking about a needle. But it's definitely something, and I would say 95% of my clients give it on their own, no problem.
But it is a script product, so you'll have to get it through your veterinarian. You can administer it, but you have to get it through a veterinarian.
Oh, Interesting. That's good to know. Dr. Joe, do you have any thoughts on supplements?
Yeah, so I kind of take maybe the opposite approach to it in that I'm not proactive with supplements. I think that, even in disease states outside of the adequate, which is a drug, the actual supplements the evidence is fairly weak, even in a disease state. There's no way to conduct a study to show that there's a preventative manner to their prevention. And so I'm kind of a less is more guy, and it's kind of how I approach life. And so I treat problems when they occur, but in a normal, healthy, active dog, a good quality food is the path that I'm taking. I think it's a simpler path, and I don't think the evidence is there as much as we'd like for some of the supplements, and so I haven't chose that path. I don't think it's wrong. It's just I'm a less is more guy, and I'll use those supplements in a disease state, not in a maintenance of health state. So,
Josh, Ray, do you guys use any supplements?
Yeah, I mean, we did exactly what Janelle was talking about with all our dogs. Again, a little different than the average hunter whose dogs aren't working as much, but when those dogs were working every day, my feeling was, if you get 6, 7, 8 years old and you wait till they start to show those changes, and you have those arthritic changes and the joint issues, you're probably going to cut their career down potentially by a year or two. So I was on board with trying to do a little bit more of the preventative so I could maximize that dog's career.
How about yourself, Josh? Do you advocate for anything for your clients and puppy owners?
Yeah, we don't use a lot of supplements. Yeah, I do believe that, feeding a high quality food is extremely important. Like Dr. Joe has said, but, there are some situations, kind of like what Ray had said from a preventative standpoint that, we'll use and just kind of help you get ahead of some things. But yeah, I really think the high quality food is extremely important. And just way too often, it's easy to get food that's maybe not as high quality, right? Or like to look at saving some dollars and feeding your dog less, and you really don't realize what you're doing to their body, especially over years, with skimping on that food. So getting the right food and nutrition, I think, is extremely important.
That's
I'll
huge.
throw in there too, just to back up even before the foods and the supplements. I think some of it too is the breeding issues, right? And making sure that we're breeding dogs, that an athlete shouldn't develop arthritis at 7. I don't care how hard, I go and do multiple marathons a year, and it's not causing arthritis if I'm taking care of myself. Now, I tore my ACL. I'm going to have problems in that knee. And so, especially in the Labrador world where we have so many dogs having cruciate injuries and elbow dysplasia issues and things like that. And so I think, are we addressing it with these supplements, or should we be putting pressure on breeders and trialers to not breed some of these dogs that have some of these issues? Would be kind of even backing the train up a little bit further. It's just a little bit of a soapbox issue of mine that like a healthy dog, I don't care how active he is, should not just naturally develop arthritis at 7, 8 years old. And I see a lot of kennels say that they retire dogs, at 7 and 8 because of arthritis issues. And that's not the natural course. It's just not.
So a minute about what these dogs are going through. I think the reason why we're seeing arthritis at 5 and 6 years of age is because of what's happening to these dogs in the field. They're going head over butt, taking these tremendous falls, going full out across the field. And this occurs on a weekly basis with these guys. They're taking these grunts, these impacts to their joints. And, you'll take x-rays of 4-year-old field trial dogs that have tremendous arthritis in multiple joints, and they did not have dysplasia as a puppy. So I think a lot of what we're dealing with is the impact on the joint simply because of their job, like what they're having to do and what they're going through in the field. And that's way different than a hunting dog that's just hunting for, 3 months a year.
But I guess what I would contend, you're not seeing that necessarily as much on the pointing dog side or in sled dogs or some of these other dogs that you're running just as hard, correct?
Absolutely. And I totally agree with you that we are not responsible breeders in the retriever world at all.
Right. That's my point is we have plenty of dogs that work harder than your retrievers.
Yeah.
that do not have arthritis issues at 5, 6, 7, correct?
That's right. That is
Okay.
right. Absolutely, no doubt. But they do, I think they do suffer more injury because of how we run them, how early we run them as puppies. You know, the amount of work that we put these puppies through when their joints are not actually, you know, completely fused, I think is a huge player in that we are creating this inflammation at a young age that, you know, normal dogs are not enduring.
Right. But back to my contention, then we should be addressing that problem versus trying to just squeak another year out with supplements. If
Yeah.
we'd fix the original issues, we wouldn't have to. That's my point, is that the supplement's not necessarily the correction of it all. I think that we have a breeding issue in the retriever world that we do stick our head in the sand too much. I think, in my opinion, like it's a major problem in the retriever world.
Agreed.
Yeah, great, fantastic discussion. I love it. I wanted to back up quick before we're going to get off nutrition and kind of move into conditioning. But one last thing is, you know, regardless of the type of food you're feeding, I would love to know, like, what are you focused? What are the attributes of a quality food? To Josh's point, that's, you know, he said that's very important. So what does that look like? What should people be looking at when they go to their store and they're looking on the shelf?
Go ahead, Ray.
I was going to let the doctors take this
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. But I thought veterinarians don't get any dog food education. Isn't that what everybody, all the breeders and trainers tell everybody? No,
Go ahead, Dr. Joe.
I'm happy to take it. So I think the big thing is sticking with a quality manufacturer. And that might sound like such a cliche answer, but it's really the truth. Like, in the sporting dog world, there's, in my opinion, two major players that produce very good quality foods that care about our industry and they care about the dogs. And so what I tell people, you know, everybody wants to find that secret food with a secret ingredient. And are you buying science that's meant to make this dog perform and live longer? Or are you buying a marketing story? And the vast majority of the foods on the shelf are a marketing story. Most of those companies don't have nutritionists on board. They don't have veterinary staff. They are purely a marketing company. And so that story on the bag might sound super cool, but it doesn't mean that it's going to make your dog live and perform longer. And so, you know, looking for good quality animal-based ingredients from companies that have contracts with their suppliers so that when there is some type of disruption in the world, they're going to get those same quality ingredients. They have their shipping locked in so that, you know, 15 years ago, we saw a huge spike in gas prices and it really affected the pet food world. And you have two choices, right? Mark up your prices or lower the price of or the quality of your ingredients. And the big guys are not going to cheapen their product in order to capture those same margins. And so I think it's you're not going to go into that pet store and discover some secret formula that somebody's never seen before. And that's going to be the magic formula. I think the other thing we see in the sporting dog world is that these smaller companies come into the sporting dog world. They give out pallets of food to mid and low level professionals and start a viral campaign of this is the greatest new formula on earth and everybody wants to switch. And then we see those issues happen that company has to make some choices and either their quality or their prices come back in line with everybody else. Where with the major manufacturers, you just don't see that. These guys really do want these dogs to live forever and have the science behind their formulas. And so I think, you know, a major manufacturer developing a formula for the dogs we hunt with is where you want to be, in my opinion.
Awesome. Yeah, I've heard that as well. So I appreciate you talking us through that. Is there any other last touch points anyone wants to make on nutrition before we progress into the conditioning side of it? All right. Well, we'll dive right in then. Admittedly, I am a pointing dog guy. I've got pointing dogs, so I am just as curious to learn on this side of it how you get your dogs into shape for the season. Like I know, Ray, you were saying that a lot of these field trial dogs stay pretty hooked up throughout the whole year. But Josh, I don't, Josh or Ray, either one of you, I would love to just get a 30,000 foot view on, you know, kind of what the traditional approach is to conditioning a retrieving dog. How do you get them into shape?
Yeah, well, the first and foremost is being active, with your dog. And, from a training standpoint, I think that's the one failure that, so oftentimes is made. And I get it, life takes priority. You have kids, you have work, you have T-ball games, dance recitals. I understand it, but yeah, at the same side, your dog is the one that suffers. And so come September 1st and it's 80 some degrees outside, and you're going to ask them to go pick up 15 doves or 30 honkers, and they're not ready for it. And that's not on them, right? So getting them active and having a training regimen that you go out and be that active lifestyle with them, that is important. And it doesn't take an hour a day. We could talk 10 15 minutes a day, and you can get a lot of work done with that dog. We love swimming. We do a lot of water setups this time of year. One, because it helps us beat the heat a little bit. Of course, the water isn't a cure-all to where you just throw the heat to the wind, don't worry about it, but it does help us beat it. And swimming is just a very productive exercise for these dogs, especially if they're just kind of coming into training and having to kind of knock off that rust and get loose again. So swimming has been a great one for us. Ben, you and back in my field trial pony dog days too, your roading would be something that we would do a lot of. And I don't love it with my retrievers. I really prefer, swimming and doing, what they were made to do. But it's just a little different thought there.
I would just say, it all starts right back where we talked about to begin with, was with weight. So if you can start at a healthy weight, it's going to be easier to get that dog in a peak physical performance. We did do a lot of roading and swimming, both. I think to the extent that we took it, the average person doesn't need to, but starts with getting, to me, it starts with getting your weight at a normal deal. And sometimes that's cutting their food back and starting with leash walks, walk them for 20 minutes a day or something, to start to get that weight down. And then when you start to feel like they can handle more of a workload, then it's, and I'll let Janelle take this over, because she really developed our program for us. But it's a steady trot, much like, roading with the pointers, but just a lot distance and a lot of swimming. We did a lot of kayaking where the dogs would follow us behind the kayak. We'd have 4 or 6 of them at a time, and we would go out and we'd swim them. And you'd be amazed at 10 minutes of steady swimming how tired they get. So, starting there and building up their endurance in the water. I mean, you see, I think, respiratory rates and muscle mass and all those things were dramatically affected in a good way when we really took the time and committed to a roading system. And I'll let Janelle explain it a little more in depth.
Yeah, I was going to say, Dr. J, you've obviously spent a fair amount of your career in this expertise particular. So I'm curious to see what kind of your regimen that you've developed and how that unfolds.
So certainly prior to coming into major season or the hunting season, my ideal scenario is to have an 8-week regimen for a dog that's going to compete or hunt. And essentially that allows us to build up from on the roading side, a 10-minute road, working up to 30 to 35 minutes over the course of that 8 weeks. And ideally I'm roading 2 to 3 times a week, and I'm also swimming. So depending on how much access we have to the ability to get these dogs in water or road, if someone can't road as much as they can swim, then I would do 3 days of swimming and 2 days of roading. So trying to get it to the point where we're working up over that 8-week period to a 20-minute swim in the water with no breaks and a 30 to 35-minute road at around 5 to 6 miles per hour would get most retrievers into a moderate trot. Some of the taller dogs around 7 to 8 miles per hour. I would say the most important thing with roading for retrievers is matching their body types. So if you have a huge 80-pound male, you don't want to put that 80-pound male with a 45 to 50-pound female that's short-legged, okay? Because one dog is going to work harder, and it's going to be the short-legged dog. So we definitely want to match those dogs so they are roading at around the same pace and one is not working harder than the other. So that leg length is very important as well when you have multiple dogs.
For people that aren't as familiar, I know it's very quite popular in the pointing dog side. Will you just give a quick breakdown on what is roading and what that looks like if somebody doesn't maybe have the setup for it, if there's other options available?
Yeah, so essentially most of the roading is going to be broken down into two forms. One is called free roading, where the dogs essentially trot next to you in a four-wheeler, or some people have golf carts or use their bike. Another scenario would be harness roading, which is what I prefer. So that's where the dogs are on a harness that's attached to the four-wheeler, and you are setting the pace for the dog. The most important thing is the actual steady pace, because we want to keep them their heart rate at a steady rate for the extended period of the workout, just like we do for human workouts, same way, right? We're trying to build endurance, so cardiac and respiratory. And if we allow that dog to kind of start and stop when they're free roading, they tend to do that. I think you're not getting as much of the benefit as you could. And also it can be a little bit more dangerous with dogs running around the four-wheeler if they're not familiar with it. Certainly even dogs that are familiar, you can run into them pretty easily. So I prefer the harness system for my dogs.
So actually, I'm sorry not to interrupt you, Ben, but I had a question the other day from an amateur trainer that competes a little bit, but also is a big hunter. And he said he doesn't have access to a four-wheeler. So he asked about getting a treadmill and using that. I mean, what do you think of that option, Dr. J? Or what are some ulterior options for people that don't have a field and a four-wheeler that they can go use all the time?
Yeah, I think a treadmill is definitely a good option. Most retrievers tend to do pretty well. They learn pretty quickly. A lot of times I'll even put a bumper in their mouth when I'm teaching them how to walk on a treadmill. The most important thing is making sure that they are controlled, that you have a harness on them and you have the ability to start and stop. So if they were to, start to jump off or roll off the back, you have that emergency brake. I like some of the dog treadmills that are kind of have a longer belt, but they also have sides on them. So it's easier to kind of keep the dog on the belt than some of the human treadmills that are open on all sides. And if I do have a human treadmill, I'll put it up against a wall to kind of try to take one of those sides away. But definitely treadmill is a good option. And also there is a resistance band system for people that don't have either of those abilities. And that is called a Beco band sport band system, which is 3 different resistance bands. Again, these bands are just hooked to a regular D-ring harness and the dog simply walks with them, and it helps build hind end strength. So it's not as great for respiratory or cardiac endurance purposes, but if you don't have the ability to row, that is another way to help strengthen. And also just remember the simple walk. Even taking a dog for a 45 to an hour long walk is a great way to build endurance. And again, this is a fast clip walk. So this is we call it the limping Labrador diet. So it gets people's weight down as well as their dogs, because it's a tremendous effort to walk an hour.
For sure. Great question, Ray. Kind of on the same train of thought, a lot of places right now it is extremely hot, and with even swimming, but especially with roading or free running. Dr. Joe, would you just kind of just go through what that looks like in terms of signs to look out for and how to know when your dog is potentially in trouble heat wise?
Yeah. And the one thing I'd add about the water too is the depth of water, right? So, swimming in a lake, that water temperature is going to be nice and cool. Using splash water, especially when you have multiple days of heat, can cause that to be warm. So, being conscious of the water work that you're doing is super important. That's just what I was just going to tag on to the previous discussion is making sure that you're aware of that. With a dog that's starting to overheat, what we're going to notice is that tongue is going to get really extended out of its mouth. It gets really flat. They're trying to move a lot of air. So it's not that hot or excited pant that at the end of a hunt. This is almost a roaring because they're trying to get that mouth as open as wide as possible and get that air moving. You'll start noticing the saliva get really ropey and thick because two things: they're maybe getting a little dehydrated. They're also not taking the time to swallow because all they want to do is try to move air and cool down. And then for me, I think it's the look in the eyes. And so they have a boss, I'm in trouble look. It's a completely different look than just a warm dog. And when you get that look, it's time to start the cooling mechanism and get that dog cooled down, shut things down, and start addressing that. And so I think understanding your dog is important, and understanding like when they get too warm. The other thing that I advocate for people to do is understanding what their dog's working temperature is. And so, you get these hot days, you get your dog nice and warm, but he's not even close to being overheated. Slap the thermometer in to get an idea of what your dog's running temperature is, so that when you do get into trouble, you're aware of where a starting point might be and in what direction you need to go from there. So it's really important to understand all these things before you actually get into the moment with an overheated dog.
Yeah, for sure. And Dr. J, I know we did another webinar on Monday for the pointing dog people, and Dr. J, you had some great insight there. Would love to hear that as well around heat.
For the overheating dogs. Yeah. So I think that the most important thing is to remember that when their body temperatures get to a point where they're no longer coming down on their own. So some of these dogs can come off at 109, 110, and that can be a normal working temp. But if they are not cooling, and like Dr. Joe said, you have that thermometer in and you're seeing that temperature rise instead of come down, you're getting yourself in trouble. And the most important thing is cooling that dog as quickly as possible. So using ice water, using fans to try to help that airflow, using a water bottle that you can spray the back of their throat to help break up that thick mucus. All of those things help cool, but the most important thing is to immediately start to cool the dog and take that body temperature every minute to 2 minutes to make sure it's coming down. Typically, I will maintain cooling. So that would be ice or ice water or cold water. Even if I have a pond close to me, I'm going to immerse the dog in the water until that dog is around 103 degrees. And then I'm going to pull all that cooling away and then simply just, add access to water, maybe keep the fan on the dog at that point. But the most important thing is the faster we get that core body temperature down, the better for the dog long term.
And I think just to echo a couple of things that she mentioned, ice water, ice, and water. And unfortunately, there is a lot of misinformation coming out where people say you can't use those things, that you should use rubbing alcohol. And I think it needs to be reiterated. Like, those of us in this world use ice and ice water and cool those dogs down. And so it disheartens me when I see emails come out or other information where you can't use those things. It absolutely is untrue, especially when you're out in the field with the dog. Those are going to be the two things that you're going to usually have access to. And then the third is the air movement. So whether that's a crate fan or getting them in the vehicle with the fan blowing across them. And so it's getting them cooled down, getting that water against their body, and then moving air. And I don't know where this shift happened, but it seems like there's a lot of information out there saying, oh, you can't use water, you can't use ice, you got to use rubbing alcohol. And it just could not be further from the truth. You just got to get that dog cooled down.
Yeah, for sure. And Josh, actually, I think I saw a while ago one of your videos. You had a great tactic for cooling dogs, especially in the kennel.
Yeah, one of the things, especially when we're on the road, so this came back, when we were really trialing a lot, you're on the road a lot, and dogs are in the box a lot. We always had cots that you had inside for the dogs to lay on, and the cots just made it to where you're just like, in the winter, we'd want something, even straw, something that the dogs can lay on and kind of collect that heat. We like the cots because there could be air underneath them. But when we were traveling, what I would do is I'd stop and just get bags of cubed ice at the gas station and kind of break it up and just throw it underneath those cots, and you just kind of kept that that underbelly of that dog cool without them actually having to lay in the ice, of course. And then of course when you start moving, now you have airflow in there too. And so Just when you're traveling, I think that can kind of be taken for granted, for, when we're traveling, and then you just think, there's air movement and the dog should just be cooling down. And obviously that may not be the case depending on where it is that you're living. And I'm really glad, that Dr. Spoon, Dr. J, mentioned that, because, we have heard in our circles the same stuff that, Dr. Spoon just mentioned, that you can't use ice water and you can't use these things. Well, and the reality is that, how often are those of us are actually carrying rubbing alcohol instead of being somewhere where we can actually get the dog cooled down. I think people overthink and panic rather than just getting that dog cool. And so, knock on wood, I've only seen it a handful of times, but I can tell you, when I've seen it, it has not been a fun thing to see.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, scary stuff. Along that kind of in the same vein, we're talking about conditioning and getting dogs ready. There was a question brought up that reminded me of a subject. When we talk about young dogs versus adult dogs and conditioning, what does that look like? How do you, I mean, do you treat them differently? What's the story with how you have to approach those two different age dogs?
So for puppies, I'm a huge advocate of more water is better. So again, all about keeping stress off of those joints when those growth plates are not closed. There's a high incidence of potential injury for the growth plates themselves, as well as the cartilage. So certainly, I'm not going to be roading those dogs until they're, for most retrievers, around 14 months is my cutoff. So dogs 14 months or younger, I try to stay away from roading. Again, larger breed, large males, sometimes 80, 90-pound males can go even longer than that before their growth plates are closed. But essentially, staying away from that excessive pounding when they're puppies, I think, is critical. And even talking about on the training end too, we do a lot of repetitive yard work for puppies in the retriever world. And I think we really need to start focusing more on doing more repetition in water versus land, because it's a tremendous tax on these dogs' joints when that growth plate is not closed.
Yeah, and then so the question that we had a viewer ask was about age of dogs for spaying and neutering, and Dr. Joe, I know you've talked about that extensively. Would love to get your take.
Yeah. So, not to plug my site, but on my website, I did just complete like this week will be the fifth in a 5-week series on this subject of spaying and neutering, particularly because there's a lot of new research that has come out and in where we've looked at that. And I think, the big thing is the take home point is getting that dog to maturity. And so, as we look at different breeds, we know that, some dogs, it might be as young as 6 months, other dogs, it's 2 years of age, where we're going to have joint issues or more predisposition to cancer. With female golden retrievers now, we think maybe we should never spay them or do ovary sparing. And so I think the point of it all is that there isn't a black and white other than don't do it too soon. And that's where I think as a profession, those of us in the sporting dog world exclude it. We've often advocated for keeping these dogs intact longer. But I think, the studies, even though they say, 6 or 12 months of age, it's not an optimum time. It's just don't do it before then. And so my personal is getting that dog into that 12, 18 months based on size. So a smaller sporting breed, if we have to, are going to spay and neuter, maybe in that 12 months. But the retrievers, I'm usually pushing for 2 years of age. I think the interesting thing for me that's come out of a lot of this research is that not always, the focus has always been on males, right? That we knew that testosterone helped close the growth plates, and it was more letting that male get in, especially with, in a 1 dog or 2 dog home where they're probably going to be spayed and neutered. We kind of poo-pooed the female and said, well, we just can do her before the first heat because we're going to prevent mammary cancer. And what we know now is, one, that study that veterinarians have quoted for, I think, going on about 50 years wasn't a good study. And so there's not, your dog's not going to die from mammary cancer if you let it go through a heat cycle, is kind of the summation. But what we find is that those females are just as prone to joint problems and issues if they're spayed too soon. And so I think, the moral of the story is we've probably been doing it way too early, especially in these large breed dogs as a profession. And we need to probably wait out into that 12 at the earliest, but even maybe that 18 to 24 month would be better if you're going to proceed with it. I think the other thing, and especially people in the performance dog world, one of my hopes is that it's going to change the profession from basically treating people with intact animals as pariahs. And, one of the most common questions of sporting dog owners is, well, do you know a vet that likes sporting dogs? Because every time I take my dog in, they're pressuring us to spay and neuter the dog. And my hope is that as this information comes out, that, really the information presented now, we can kind of satisfy all those things and it's a right decision. If you want to spay or neuter your dog, great, but let's wait and do it at this time that's better for the dog. And if you want to keep your dog intact, great, but here's some things that we're going to want to watch for maybe later in life, like with pyometras with females. And so I think, the take home point is, as a profession, we've pushed too early, too often, and there's information to kind of support what more, I don't say optimal timing, but appropriate timing if we're going to do those procedures is waiting is better.
Dr. Spoo, I have a question for you based on that. Hope I'm not putting you on the spot. So we hear that a lot, from clients of, gosh, I wish my vet was more sporting dog minded because, they want me to spay and neuter at 6 months. And they just say I have to get it done, and, they're pressuring me to do it. Why is that? Is it generally because, we as sporting dog owners are a fraction of the ownership out there, or, what is that?
No, I think it's the history of the profession, and and again, not to push the series, but I actually, the first video in the series was, how did we get here? And a lot of it has to do with what we were taught in vet school, that it was basically, assumed that, and I had this impression that, these bitches were going to have mammary cancer and die from mammary cancer if we didn't spay them before their first heat cycle. The other part is pet overpopulation, and there's a lot of veterinarians that are passionate about that aspect of it. And so it's one that, if you right now, even with this information out there, go on to veterinary Facebook groups and forums where it's just veterinarians having this discussion, you would be shocked at the number of people that are questioning this research or saying they're not going to follow it because they just feel there's going to be this massive explosion of pet overpopulation and issues with these dogs. And so it's kind of what we've been ingrained for, several generations of veterinarians. We've kind of been told we have to spay and neuter these dogs, on the male side of things, it's for cancers as well and things like that. But as we do the research, well, now we know that neutered males actually get prostate cancer more than intact males. And so it's the information wasn't there, and it was a lot of either, not great science that we were making these decisions on, or emotions that, as a profession, we see the worst side of it too. And so, those in the sporting dog world see kind of the best of the best, right? You surround yourself with like-minded people that really take care of their dogs and are good owners. There's a whole other segment of the pet owning population that doesn't fit that mold that a lot of other veterinarians see. And I think, the problem is the blanket recommendations, right? It's either this way or this way versus having that individual discussion with each of your clients that are before you. And I think that's where we got into trouble as a profession. It was 4 to 6 months, 4 to 6 months, 4 to 6 months. And everybody drank that Kool-Aid and believed it versus, oh, you have a working dog and you're an educated owner that maybe, wants to breed. Let's have that discussion, and so it needs to go back to being individual medicine. And so it's also a bit of a black eye to the profession, right? Like if we say, maybe we've been causing some of these cancers and other issues that we see in certain breeds. Well, that doesn't feel good to say for the last, 20 years of my career, if I was making those recommendations that maybe I was causing some of those problems. And so it's going to take a while for that shift to take place. I think we'll get there, but there's pushback within the veterinary community right now against these new guidelines and new studies because of the other reasons and why we got there. And so I honestly, I don't think it's a ill intent of those veterinarians. I think in their heart of hearts, they really believe what their recommendations are based on a lot of the education we receive early in our careers. Dr. J, any?
I think that was incredibly well said, and I 100% agree. I have several associates that are primarily working in shelters. They're shelter veterinarians, and I could sit down and have this conversation with them until I was blue in the face, and and they would 100% still go against exactly what I recommend for my clients because of what they see and what they deal with. So it really is very dependent on, the veterinarian's own experience in practice, for sure.
And I think that's so important, especially for, the average person that has a gun dog. I mean, how do you guys, suggest someone in that position to go out and find the right vet for them? Because yeah, I totally understand what you guys are saying, and I love that there's passion behind someone's profession and what they believe in. But of course, that I think just kind of highlights the importance of finding a vet that speaks your language.
Yeah, that's a great point, Josh. And I think, we're starting to be able to have those resources now with the College of Sports Medicine. Yeah, and Dr. Joe is a member of that. There's these professionals and these specialists available, and now we have the list of those veterinarians, going to the website, looking at the college and looking at these vets across the country. No, there are not enough of those guys out there, but the college is new. There are more residents coming out all the time. So I think we're moving in the right direction with sports med. But definitely that would be a first place to look, would be the College of Sports Medicine. It's a collection of veterinarians that are board certified in both equine and canine sports medicine. So that would be a great direction, at least, to get started and trying to find someone.
I think too, like reading bios on websites, because it's you get to certain parts of the country and you're going to have fewer of those specialists and fewer of even rehab specialized veterinarians that have gone through advanced rehab training are usually going to have a better eye. But when you look at that vet's bio and it says, even if it's things like agility or other dog activities, while it might not be in your wheelhouse, they're at least going to appreciate performance dogs, and it might be a place to start a conversation. And so I'm always shocked at veterinarians that don't have like dog related hobbies. And, I'm in a group that obviously our careers and our hobbies are all tied around these dogs. And like, that was like one of the things when I got to vet school that just like blew my mind, that like, not all veterinarians love dogs. Like those of us on this call love dogs. And it's crazy to think that. And so digging into that bio, like, do they even own dogs? Which you'll be shocked. You read a lot of veterinarian bios and they don't even own pets. And so, do they do things with their dogs? They might understand your passion, your level, and be able to at least have that conversation, even if it's not that they hunt. Because I think the converse happens too. I know a lot of hunting veterinarians, they're kind of crappy veterinarians. And so it's not a guarantee that they're going to be giving you good quality service. And so I think it's finding that veterinarian that like gets dogs and got into the profession because of dogs. And it might not be a hunting veterinarian, but if it's somebody that really gets dogs, that they're going to be a good resource to start with.
Yeah, and just from a traveling standpoint, that I'll kind of put in here, because it's something that I really put a priority on doing. Anytime that I'm traveling, we travel a lot, especially during the season. If I know I'm going to be in an area, I do that research that Dr. Spooky just talked about the vets that are going to be in that area. So if I do have an emergency, I do have to get somewhere right now, I don't have to try to scramble and try to find or guess, where I'm going to go. I have confidence of, hey, I may not know this vet, but from what I'm seeing, what I'm reading, in my area, if I have an emergency, this is where I'm going to go. I save that number and contact in my phone so I can get to them quickly. Because in the case of an emergency, especially if you're in the field and something traumatic happens, obviously you're probably not going to be in a mental or emotional state to just kind of calm down and go through those steps. So I'd recommend that to anybody that is traveling, having that peace of mind. Heaven forbid you need it, but having that peace of mind, I think, is a really valuable thing.
I think that's a great point, Josh. And also, what's great about, I think, our world, in as kind of small as it is, we also know a lot of people across the country that are in our arena, right? So reaching out to people that we just know in that area and say, hey, who's your vet? Who do you go to for these sporting injuries? So just word of mouth by people across the country is certainly very helpful, but I think that's a wonderful idea and more people should do that.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic discussion. going back to the spay and neuter part, the worst part is trying to go into the vet and play I know more than you, I want to do this, and have them look at you like you're an absolute idiot. So I've been through that before, and it's not fun. So finding the right vet is a great deal. But I don't know if there's any, again, wrap up on conditioning. I do want to talk a little bit. I want to get kind of talk about some of the common injuries we see. And then I saw there are a couple questions that we've got to get to. But any other points you'd like to make on conditioning, getting your dog ready?
The only thing I would say that ties the conditioning and the nutrition together is that Dr. J mentioned the 8-week conditioning program. And if you are switching formulas, so if you go to a maintenance formula to performance formula, that's the time frame too that you'd want to switch back to the performance formula. It takes the body's machinery about 8 weeks to get used to that higher protein, higher fat. And so, we're kind of getting into that window now that if you have to switch to a maintenance to keep the calories off, but you do use a performance food in the fall, that 8-week number is a good number to remember.
Awesome.
And just one point on beginning conditioning, always remember the most important thing is not bringing that dog out of the truck or off the couch and placing them right on that roading harness or throwing them in the pond. Make sure that you are warming up and cooling down these dogs. This is the most important thing for prevention of injury because we're bringing blood flow to the soft tissues. So making sure that we're walking for 5 to 10 minutes on lead, where we're actually keeping that constant pace and getting that blood flow to all the soft tissues. Very important, as well as cooling down the same way. Done exercising, done hunting, back on lead, and a 5 to 10 minute very slow walk to bring that heart rate down slowly so the blood is not pooling in the soft tissues and causing soreness or tightness, restriction of range of motion. So 2 very important parts that are actually very easy and most people don't think about it.
Great point. So I would like to talk a little bit about common issues you see in the field, and whether it's how to prevent them or probably how to prevent them, and then maybe a little bit on how you would go about treating them. But Dr. J, you're doing this a lot of days out of the year. So what are the most common injuries you're seeing with retrieving dogs?
So I would say most common is definitely shoulder injuries, a lot of chronic repetitive type strain injuries. So bicep tendonitis, bicep tendinopathies, very, very common. And it's also called jump down syndrome. So I know Dr. Joe had brought this up before, but one point is these dogs coming down out of a truck over and over and over again in their career and over their lifespan puts a tremendous amount of stress specifically on their front end. And so doing everything you can to moderate that, whether it's helping them out or using a ramp, but definitely those are some things you can do to help prevent that repetitive type stress injury. But again, for soft tissue injury, warming up is the most important thing, getting that blood flow. But also I see a lot of digit injuries. So sesamoids specifically, which are their little knuckle bones, just like we have knuckles. Many times they're running through uneven ground or over uneven ground, and the paw will just sort of dip into a hole and cause some localized inflammation around that little sesamoid bone. And that can cause a dog to be 3-legged lame many times, very, very sore, very inflamed. So that's a pretty common thing I see. And what's great about that injury is they usually come back from it pretty quickly. But that's something where I would use an anti-inflammatory and icing specifically in that area. So those are the 2 big things I see. And then certainly from the launching standpoint, soft tissue wise in the back end, iliopsoas, tightness and soreness. So that would be the groin muscle. Takes a big hit what these guys do in the field with the sprinting that they do. And also, unfortunately, cruciate injuries are becoming more and more common as well. So that's a big thing that I see.
How about yourself, Dr. Joe?
Yeah, I would echo all of those. I think the cruciate I hate. I think I hope we get to a point in time where we have a way to intelligently breed with it in mind. And I don't say around it or like it's, I know Wisconsin has developed a test. I think there's more to it than that, because it can be, I think, a genetic issue and a traumatic issue. But I think it's kind of gotten out of hand. Particularly, I think we're breeding so many dogs that have had bilateral repairs that's part of the problem as well. And it just goes back to that putting pressure on breeders to not accept that. It's, if you have a truck full of dogs, having a dog on the sideline for 8 weeks every time its knee goes out is one thing. But, with that one dog owner, we'll see a lot of people that come in that, the dog blows the first knee before the first hunting season, and it blows the second knee before the second hunting season. And we have a 3 or 4 year old dog that the owner has, $10,000 to $15,000 into, that's never seen the field. And so cruciates is a big one. And then the other traumatic sort of things, right? So, with jumping into cattails or into flooded timber where we didn't clear the area around where that dog is making its water entry, I think is super important. So we'll see some penetrating type of wounds related to that sort of thing. With field hunting, stalks through the bottom of the feet. And so, making sure you're doing a tailgate exam at the end, that we don't have some type of injury. And then with water retrieves, making sure you're clearing that area. Even if it's an area you typically hunt, you can have some of that submerged stuff, especially with timber and branches and things, that kind of sneaks in, especially if you're using, boat or wading, where you've maybe kind of stirred things up. I'll never forget, I had a client that taking his son on his very first hunt with a young dog. And they'd called me, they were up in Northeast South Dakota, and the very first retrieve of the youth season, this dog jumped out and she just completely impaled herself on a stick, on a stump out in the water, and hung up on it, penetrated through her abdomen, and just a horrible experience for that kid to experience in his very first hunt. And so clearing, so we don't have these, unnecessary or preventable traumatic injuries, I think is important.
Mm. Yeah, that's something that I actually pretty religiously do on any hunt that we have. Is I'll do that. We hunt a lot in the woods down south, and man, there's just so much debris, and these dogs are so enthusiastic on these water entries. I know everybody loves seeing a retriever do the big water entry, but it's also the easiest way for them to get hurt if there is something in that water. And so we do that same thing that Dr. Spudia talked about. Is I just sweep back and forth and kick around and make sure there's nothing that dog could potentially hit. And then I'll actually do the same thing on a field setup. Is I'll walk that field and kind of span that back and forth. You'd be shocked at how many times I find a big hole that maybe a dog could be going full tilt and not know it's there, and hit that thing. So just different things that we can do to prevent those horrific situations from happening. And then the other one that I would kind of touch on, because it's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, is running these dogs in the water when it is extreme cold. And I think especially nowadays with social media, everybody wants to look how tough my dog is, and you get your dog. We hear a lot of pretty horror stories about dogs going into that hypothermic state, and again, it's not the dog's fault. The dog has the heart and wants to keep going. That's just the owner lacking shutting that dog down, or it's not the worst thing in the world to miss a morning of hunting. I know it may feel like it in the moment, but if it's not safe for the dog, it's just one of those deals. We're going to sit it out. So something to think about.
Yeah, I was actually, I'm glad you said that, because that was the next thing I was going to say was, we've talked a lot about heat, right? And rightfully so. We're trying to get them in condition. It's warm. Early season is often warm, but a lot of duck season is not warm temperatures. So water temperatures go down. Sometimes we have to deal with, there's ice or slush. I mean, I'd like to know what the doctors think, like, what signs could you recognize, when a dog's starting to get hypothermic, or what would signs be when you think, like, I need to do what's best for the dog. We need to get them out of the situation, or ways to try to prevent, I hunt I use a vest a lot, the neoprene vest, which I think help, but obviously isn't going to prevent it. I've hunted with a lot of guys. If you're out of a boat or out of a blind, they'll have hay or straw. Some of them will have a heater in the blind, so when the dog comes back in, it can, help warm them up a little bit, or towels to try to get some of that extra water. But, what are some of the symptoms or signs that you would see that dog in those cold conditions when you would think, all right, enough is enough? we need to be smart here.
So I think it's almost the opposite of heat stroke. I think with heat stroke, a dog will go right up to the point that it dies, and so you have to be really aware of it. I think on the other end of the spectrum, in my experience, the dog is going to let you know and say, "Hey, I'm not feeling it." But the problem exists is that people think it's a training issue and that the dog is refusing to cast or refusing to send. And I think that that's where the problem. And so I personally don't worry as much about hypothermia as I do heat stroke, because I think that the dog is going to let me know and it's going to show you. And so I've hunted even, my cocker when it was, sub-zero wind chill and freezing temperatures, but I let her kind of dictate things, right? And it was very strategic. And so, to your point with the vest, I think the vests are important, getting the dog out of the water. So if you're hunting in standing timber and that dog's, in 3 inches of water, is totally different than, say a Missouri River boat blind where the guys have the stoves in there and heaters for the dogs. And, in between retrieves, that dog's getting out of the wind, out of the water. And so, I think these dogs can retrieve in extremely cold weather. I think it's more on the handler, to Josh's point, not, thinking, oh, I'm cool and tough and my dog's going to do it. I think in cold weather, the dog gives plenty of cues that before it gets into trouble, that it's not mentally sharp. It's just not into it. They just kind of shut down. And I know it's the waterfall one, but we should have covered it on the pointing dog one, because you'll see that with the pointing dogs as well. Pheasant hunting late season where they might be running and they're doing great, and you stop and talk about how we're going to get back to the truck, and that dog stops and that wind chills that dog down. And man, I've seen pointers just completely shut down out in the middle because they quit running and they got cooled down. And I think it's that sort of thing, being conscious of where that dog's sitting. Is it getting hit by wind? Is it out of the water? Appropriately dry? They can retrieve in very cold weather. But when that dog says, I'm not feeling it, you have to pay attention, get them warmed up and shut it down.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'll tell everyone a little quick story on this because Dr. Swift, if you remember this, I called you on Tucker, this year when we were down in Arkansas. But we had this very similar situation where we had, big blind. It was cold, but it wasn't, when you think of cold, you think of like breaking ice, you think of like this like extreme cold. But I mean, the water temperature, was cold. And he was sitting in an area that, although I couldn't feel it where I was in the blind, there was a swirl of wind that kept hitting him in that box. And of course, I realized it later. But his cue to me was, I mean, this is a dog with a big heart and a big motor. And he had picked up a few birds, and I sent him on a blind, and he ran it well. And he came back and I lined him up, and I said back, and he didn't even flinch. And that was my cue, and that's all it took, And I think to Dr. Spoo's point, too many of us would look at that and be like, you son of a gun, like you're denying my send, I'm going to force you to do it. I'm going to get on the collar. I'm going to make you do it. Like, to me, that was like, whoa, like, what's wrong, buddy? And then from that point, I could see his gums were getting white. He was he was holding himself a little different. I walked him a little bit, and he's starting to shut down on me. And so, fortunately, I was able to read that and, get him to, hey, let's get him warmed up. Let's get him in the truck. Let's get him where he should be. And he bounced out of it just fine. But Dr. Spoo, you and I had that same discussion, about this, is that I think too many times it's seen as a training situation. I'm going to make the dog do this. And the reality is it's not. I mean, that's the dog giving you that cue and that sign that something is wrong. And you just have to be aware enough, to recognize that and read it.
Awesome. Yeah. Great stuff, everyone. Want to give you guys a chance to, if there's anything that we might have not touched on that you'd like to circle back to. Otherwise, we're going to get into some questions. All right. Well, I've got a few questions here I'd like to go over quick. One was about dogs self-regulating in terms of feeding, that they'll only eat as much as they want and they just free feed. What's your take on that?
I guess I'll jump in here first, just because y'all have a non-educated answer on this, like Dr. J and Dr. Spoo will. For me, I think the biggest thing of why I like to have my dogs on a routine is because it's usually the first sign that I can tell if something's off with them. If they don't eat, if they're off, with their eating habit, that's usually a really clean sign to me of, okay, something's going on here. What is it? And maybe I can catch something early on. If I'm free feeding, I just don't think maybe I'm as attentive to detail on there, or maybe can't see it or catch it as quickly. And so, from a just a monetary standpoint, I think I monitor these dogs and their intake. That's one of the many reasons I would say that I would prefer a schedule. And then two, I think a lot of my dogs, personally, they probably would not stop eating, and so maybe I can't even give them that option. But I do think just being able to catch something that's a little off in that dog before it gets to be a major problem is one of the reasons for me.
I think that's a huge
100%,
yeah, agree. And the one thing I would say is that likely the dog is consuming more than they think. It may not be getting fat, but if you take a look at, Purina did a study called the lifespan study that I think is one of the best studies that exist in veterinary medicine. And it was that sort of study where they fed paired litter mates. They allowed one set of the dogs to eat time based, I think it was, and then they fed the other group a percentage less of that. And they fed them, it was initially as an arthritis study. And when they got to, I forget, 7, 8 years of age, there was such a significant difference in the arthritis in the dogs with restricted feeding that they fed those dogs to the end of their lives. And the dogs that were restricted fed lived 2 years, 1.8 years, but for all intents and purposes, 2 years longer than their paired litter mates. And the only difference was that restricted feeding. And so they were dying of the same things, cancers and other things, but they were living 2 years longer. And so it may seem or appear that that dog is self-regulating, but I would contend it's not. Josh's point is the very valid. Like, number one, like, you're controlling. So you understand that on day one, when that dog skipped a meal, not on day 3, when you just see that full bowl all the time and you assume that your wife or your kid maybe was filling it up. And so that's vitally important. But I think even if that's not, and when your dog stops eating, I think over the course of that dog's life, controlled feeding is the number one thing that we can do to get these dogs to live a long time.
And to go back on something that Dr. J said earlier too, with the time between when they eat and when they work, if you don't know if that dog is just eating and then you take it out in the field, now you're potentially have a dangerous situation with bloat or torsion. You're taking, and this is, you guys might correct me on this because you're the doctors, but you're taking blood away from the muscles to aid in digestion and raising that dog's temperature a little bit when they have to digest food. So if you don't know when they're eating and all of a sudden they potentially eat and then you go out and you go on a hunt, you could also put that dog in a bad situation.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, Ray. And that kind of leads me to my next question. Last thing I want to say is be sure, we'll post the link again for the giveaways tonight. Be sure to click on that link and sign up to win some cool stuff. But the question was about bloat, and it was, we know that food can cause bloat, but is giving a dog, couple part question, is giving a dog too much water or allowing them to drink too much water, will that cause bloat? And then also, what does the research say about feeding one large meal in the morning versus multiple meals throughout the day and its impact on GDV or bloat?
So I'll take the once a day versus twice a day, and I'll let Dr. J ask about the water. So in the sporting dog world, I think for forever, we've advocated once a day feeding because we know, to Ray's point with performance, not only are we not devoting blood flow and things to breaking down the nutrition, but a lot of what we used to think was stress or performance diarrhea, we know is probably mechanical damage. If we're feeding that dog twice a day, that we have things bouncing around and we're actually having mechanical diarrhea as part of it. And dogs do perform better on a fasted state. So going into that morning activity, they're going to perform better fasted. What the concern has become is that chronic once a day feeding of a large amount may later in that dog's life prone it to bloat because it's fatiguing the gastric ligament. And so I've kind of shifted a little bit. I still, on days of performance or work or things like that, I feed either post-performance once a day or, days I performance once a day. On the other days of the week, or like now going into this hot time of year, my dogs are going to get fed twice a day to try to not have that chronic once a day feeding. So there is some research that shows there's a concern with this chronic once a day feeding. If it's a large volume, you could be proning these dogs to bloat. And so I think that's a valid concern. And so, it's a quantity thing. And so with my setter, I do worry about it because I have two 50-pound dogs, a setter and a lab, and they get vastly different amounts of food. And so the lab, like most labs, can look at food and she'll get overweight. And so she's almost never above 2 cups as a total, where that setter may get up in that 5 to 6 cups, depending upon how much workload. And I'd never give him 5 or 6 cups at one setting. And so there is some concern there. And so it's the checks and balances, right? So person hunting 2 or 3 days a week could do that staggered once a day versus twice a day on non-performance days. It's a different deal for a field trial dog that is getting worked every day. That once a day feeding probably makes more sense overall. And then the water question, that one's all over the place. So feel free.
So it is a good question. I would say that, again, some dogs really do have a sort of a mental issue with water, specifically not wanting to drink all day long. And then once they get in the kennel, they go crazy. So the way I sort of deal with this is recommend, number one, feeding with water to try to sort of ward off that tanking up later on in the evening. So I do like to feed with water and also maintain access to water throughout the day. Even if the dog is not drinking, at least they have access and they have the ability to go to it at whatever point they might feel thirsty. Because again, these dogs, they come off the line, you think they're going to drink, and then they dive under the truck and they don't drink for 2 hours. So I think just having access is very important to limit tanking up. And also remembering that dogs usually they get the most thirsty within an hour of eating. So that 45-minute to hour window after they eat is when they really want to take in water to help that digestion. So, making sure that there's access at that point. So not feeding and then limiting water for several hours and bringing water in later in the evening, where then they will tank up on probably more than they actually need because they feel very thirsty. So those are 2 simple things you can do to help decrease tanking up.
And then I think,
I don't have a scientific answer like that, but I would say based on, we had a truck of 24 dogs that we had on the road, 10 months a year, or, competitions, and water balance was a huge part of that. Again, same thing. We fed wet. We made sure they had access to water. So I felt like if they ate and 2 hours later they came out, I wouldn't want them to drink a whole bowl of water because of putting that bulk in their stomach all at one time. So I feel very strongly on all the points that Dr. J just said about feeding wet, having access to water. So, I don't have a scientific answer of yes, 100% it does, but I know it made me a lot more comfortable knowing that those dogs were hydrated throughout the day and weren't coming out in the evening and trying to drink a whole bowl of water. And if I knew somebody drank too much, I would make a point to go out and check on them a couple times, whether they were in the truck or in the kennel, just to make sure there wasn't an issue going on.
Yeah, and I do think it's important to clarify, and if I missed it, you guys, I apologize. When we say feeding wet, we don't mean, put your 3 cups in the dish and then fill the rest of the bowl up, with water. And you guys, the doctors can correct me if they have a better answer to this, but what we've always done is just float the kibble. Enough water in there that the kibble just floats, and that's enough. And I do think that's important because you can overdo it on the water side if you're giving them a tremendous access, during that feeding time.
And I think the one thing I'd add too is if you have a dog that is a tanker, to everybody's point there too, is, you're not going to send that dog right back out in the field to do activity. And so that's, the overnight in the evening, if it tanks up, to Ray's point, you probably want to check on that dog. But that's also a dog that, man, if they just completely tank up, then we're not going to start, another retrieving session or back out in the field. It's interesting because that's another one of those social media things I've seen where you can't let a dog that's panting have water and stuff like that. And the very first sports medicine conference that I ever went to, one of the Southern sports medicine veterinarians would talk about how they would encourage dogs to tank up at the end of a run, and then it would usually vomit it up and act as a radiator for that dog. And so it's one of those things that, I think again, in this era of social media, you see all kinds of things, but at the end of the day, a lot of it boils down to common sense, right? And, if that dog's tanked up, we need to keep an eye on it. We need to keep it out of the field. If there's ways to get more water throughout the day, then let's do that, as opposed to that trying to tank it all at once.
And also, Ben, on the point of cooling down, another reason why cooling down can be important is water as well, because what I found is if I took the dog offline and allowed it to come to the bowl, it might tank up more. But if I took it on a 5-minute cool down walk and brought him back, they tend to drink a little less. So they might just drink enough, that initial thought of I'm really, really thirsty, I've got to drink this whole bowl. You sort of take that away by cooling them down and bringing that heart rate down. And in my experience, they definitely drink less after doing that.
And with this one real quick, I don't remember if we addressed this earlier, but letting the dog cool down completely before you feed it. So you get out of the field at the end of the day, you get done with the hunt. Everybody wants to be done. They want to head to cocktail hour. Make sure that dog is cooled down for how long do you say, doctor, before you want to feed it? Because of, just like talk about, you let the dog tank up on water till they throw up. If they're hot and you feed them, you're going to have the same thing.
Yeah, my preference is 2 hours after the last bout of activity.
Dr. Joe, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd be the same. And there's times, if it's not an incredible vigorous activity and that dog is cooled down. So especially you start talking hunting season where, you're not having this hot respiratory sort of issues. There's times I'll crank that down to an hour and I'll be fine with that. If I know that dog, you get back to the truck and that dog's immediately calm, you put him in the crate, they lay down and go to sleep on the ride home. I'm comfortable feeding that dog. So time of year, on a hot, like today, it's these last couple of days I've ran my dogs in the mornings. I've gone to once a day feedings for that very reason, because by the time I get done running and it takes them a while to cool down. I just feed them in the evenings because I don't want to take that risk. So.
Awesome. Well, absolutely fantastic discussion. I love these because I also get to learn a ton. We're at time, so I appreciate everyone that has stayed and joined us, and I appreciate our panel guests, Dr. Joe, Dr. Janelle, Josh, Ray. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and we hope everyone out there has a fantastic season and get the opportunity to work with their dogs a lot. So thank you guys again, and we hope you have a good evening.
Thanks for having us.
Bye-bye.